Someone's network connection can greatly impact their experience with your web app. If you're like me and live in a place with good internet speed, then it's easy to forget that billions of people aren't as lucky with their internet connections. YouTube's a great example of a site that adapts to a user's connection. It gives alerts when you go offline or back online, and also uses internet speed to determine the quality of the video you get. So in this video, we're going to first build this simple online-offline detector, and then detect the connection type to serve a lighter version of our app for slower connections. Before we begin, there are two views functions that have a lot of this functionality already, and I recommend using them if you're building an app for production, but in this video, we're not going to use them so we can actually understand what they're doing under the hood. So in our app, we're first going to want to get some information about the user with the window.navigator property. This gives us information about the user agent, aka info about the system and some user preferences, and then create a ref is online and have its default value set to navigator.online. Then to detect changes to our network, we can listen to two events from the window interface, online for when we gain access and offline for when we lose access. Then inside of our template, all we need is to use the value of is online to render this block if we're online or this block if we're offline. So if we take a look at our app, we can see that we currently have connection, and if we use DevTools to change our network status to off, our app will tell us that we're currently offline. And if we change it back, we once again see the green happy path. And already this one property gives us a really good way to improve user experiences, especially if you're building features that require constant connectivity like Google Docs autosave feature. But going even further, there's a really cool experimental API that you can use to improve web performance on slower devices. And that's the Network Information API. But first, I want to say thanks to the sponsor of this video, Storyblock. Storyblock is a headless CMS that I just love working with. Even though its API works with any tech stack, I've made a few videos on using it in both Nux 3 and Astro, and I love how plugged in they are with the Vue community, creating Vue plugins, Nux plugins, and a ton of things that make it really easy to build Vue components, and then directly build and edit pages with these components inside of a really sleek visual editor. This makes it so non-technical people can use your custom components really simply. It's super extensible and a great experience both on the technical side and the content side, so I highly recommend checking them out and show them some love for supporting the channel. Now let's learn about the Network Information API. It's an experimental API that, as the name suggests, gives additional information about a user's network. This includes things like their downlink speed, which is the rate that the network sends info to a user's computer, the estimated round trip time, whether or not they have the saved data user agent, and then the effective type, which determines the effective network performance based on the downlink and round trip speeds. Then, using this information, we can perform what's called adaptive loading, which means we're changing what we're delivering based off a user's network and hardware. For example, Twitter's data saver mode will only load the full-size images after you click on a button. So let's go ahead and try to recreate some version of this. To get access to the network information, we can use that same window.navigator from before and say navigator.connection. Then we'll create a refcon effective type, and for my example, I'm going to set the default to 4G, and I'll explain why later. Our next step is to add an event listener for when this connection changes, and we'll call a function called update network info. And then to update our network info on the component's first load, we want to make a direct call to that function. And since the Network Information API isn't available in every browser, we'll wrap this in an if statement. And inside our update network info function, we want to set our effective type to the connection.effectiveType. Now we can use effective type to determine the quality of the image that we load. So if we check this out in Chrome, we'll see that since I have stronger connection, we get the full-size image. But if we throttle the network, we'll get the thumbnail version of our picture. And then to allow for the loading of the full-size image, we can create a button that shows when the thumbnail version is showing. And when it's clicked, we can set some ref to true, and then also use that ref to determine which image to show. This is definitely an oversimplified example, but it shows some of the opportunities we have with this API. If you wanted to implement something like this, there are two things that you should know before you do that. First, we're going to want a little bit more complex logic. For example, in our app right now, if we start with a faster connection, we'll get the full-size image, and then if we manually change it to something slower, then we'll get the thumbnail, which doesn't make sense since we already loaded in the full-size one. For a quick pseudocode example of how to do this, we could use the image load event to keep track of what images we've loaded. Then as our network changes, we either show the highest quality that our current connection can handle, or the highest quality picture that we've already loaded in. And the second thing you should know is browser support. This API isn't supported by Safari or Firefox. This is where your default values and default experience really makes things important. If you remember, the default value for our effective type was 4G, which means in Safari, for example, we're automatically going to get the high quality image. So depending on your audience and business requirements, you're going to want to think about what you want this default core experience to be. But with how heavily used Chrome and Android are globally, I still think that these optimizations can make your website more accessible to people around the world. I hope this was a good little introduction to the Network Information API, and I hope it at least made you think about how different people experience your site. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.